Okay, now let's get started. So I hope you have a nice afternoon. Let's talk about kernel. So today, we are very glad to share our recent research on Linux kernel, that is KernJC, automated vulnerable environment generation for Linux kernel vulnerabilities. I'm Bonan, and this is Jiahao. We are a team from National University of Singapore. And this is our team logo. It is a curiosity security team. Okay. So today we will go through all the contents. Firstly, we will introduce the background of Linux kernel vulnerabilities. And after that, we will get familiar with the challenges in the kernel vulnerability reproduction. After that, we will introduce how we can solve these challenges by designing the tool, KernJC. After that, I will show how we can leverage a command line interaction like Docker, so you can use it very easily. After that, I will show you a demo of KernJC. And finally, we will have an evaluation for it to prove it can be effective for many kernel vulnerabilities. And then we will give you a conclusion. Okay, firstly, we can see that nowadays there are lots of kernel vulnerabilities. And this table, it is taken from the Google kernel CTF. You can see only in the 3 months in 2025, there are many kernel vulnerabilities get exploited. And you can see there are even a vulnerability started with 2023. That means kernel vulnerabilities are frequently discovered and exploited. And here, we will see the impact of kernel vulnerabilities. Because from the previous slides, you can see there are lots of vulnerabilities. But what impact will these kernel vulnerabilities bring? So I suggest maybe you can take photo for this picture because I will give a complete description of the attack path with kernel vulnerabilities. So what is this? This is a modern architecture of cloud computing environment. You can see we have the host, right? You have a physical machine, and based on this physical machine, you will have a virtual machine. And in your virtual machine, currently, there are lots of popular cloud-native technologies like the Docker, the container. And finally, your web application, it may run in the sandbox, application sandbox, like the Python or Node.js. So let's begin from an attacker's view. If an attacker wants to break into your environment, the easiest way is to attack your applications. For example, he can attack your application based on the Python or Node.js, and this may be the remote command execution vulnerabilities. And they can also exploit your binary programs within the sandbox. But after he get breaking into your environment, if he want to make the attack bigger, he will go to continue breakout. That is, he must to break the application sandbox, and then the container, and then the virtual machine, and finally, he will get your host. So what's the role of kernel in each step? Let's see, firstly, you can see the attacker. For their first breaking step, they can use the application level vulnerabilities. They can also use the kernel remote vulnerabilities. And for the breakout, they can also use the kernel vulnerability to break out from the containers. If they break out from the containers, they are located in the virtual machine. And now you can see within the virtual machine, there are two scenarios. The first one is the attacker is a root, and the second one is he is not a root. So if he is not a root, he can use the kernel vulnerability to escalate his privilege to a root. And if he finally gets a root in your virtual machine, right, he can exploit some vulnerabilities to get to the host. There are also two ways. One way is to exploit the Kernel, the virtual machine software itself's vulnerabilities. And the second way is to exploit the kernel vulnerabilities like the KVMs. So from this picture, we can see there are lots of impacts brought by kernel vulnerabilities. And for all the green arrow, you can see they are all the impact where the kernel vulnerability will bring. Okay, now let's talk about reproduction. So we can reproduce a vulnerability to analyze it and to get the root cause of it. For example, when a vulnerability is disclosed, we can analyze it, reproduce it to get the severity and to further prioritize it, right? You may have lots of vulnerabilities. So which one do you need to prioritize? And then if you want to detect it, mitigate it, you may design some mechanisms. For this, you still need to firstly understand its root cause and reproduce it and see whether your detect works. Third one, after you have a detection or defense mechanism, you need to evaluate whether it works. You can do it by reproduce the vulnerability. If you fail to reproduce, then maybe your defense work. So what do we need for reproduction? Firstly, maybe your brain, your patient, and your luck. But actually, in reality, we need the proof of concept or POC and the vulnerable environment. And we know in community, there are lots of people focus on the proof of concept. You know, when a vulnerability is disclosed, many people want to understand the root cause and craft the proof of concept and maybe attack the kernel. But less people focus on the vulnerable environment. Sometimes the vulnerable environment is not easy. For example, here we give a real-world scenario, which is derived from the GitHub. You can see the background or the context is that a kernel researcher, he published a blog post, and then a reader wants to follow his post to reproduce this vulnerability. But he found many difficulties. He said, hello, when building the text environment, I follow the steps above to compile the kernel. But he still kept getting stuck. And during the test, he cannot find any NFQ rule in the targets. So what does the author reply? He said, at that time, the author selected many configs, and it's possible some configs are not included in the blog post. So he just gave some very abstract, high-level suggestions. Maybe let's check if there is an issue in the completion options. But it doesn't solve the reader's problem. Here is a more concrete example. This is a very famous kernel vulnerability, CV 2021-22555. You can see it is a heap-based out-of-bounds vulnerability in Linux kernel, especially in the net filter subsystem. It has a high severity, and the attacker can leverage it to escalate his privilege to root. And we can get the vulnerable versions from the NVD database. But if we look at it closer, we can see the above code, it is the vulnerable codes in the kernel, the 5.11.22. But if you look carefully, you can see the patch, right? The patch, it is some deletion of the codes. Actually, in the above picture, the code is already deleted. So what does that mean? That means in some versions provided by NVD, it is not vulnerable version, but patched version. So if you select such versions for your vulnerability reproduction, you will fail. So we can see you can't wake up a person who is pretending to be asleep, and you can't trigger a vulnerability which has been patched. Okay, let's go on. So this is a patch snippet for the same vulnerability. You can see it modified some files, and you can get the file path from this patch. And if you find the make file for the kernel, you will see to include or to enable this path, you need to enable some configs, right? Like the config net filter, config net filter x tables. And within the vulnerable codes, you can see there is a confidential compilation option that is a config compat. So if you want to include the vulnerable code in your vulnerable kernel, you need to enable this config. So we get a first initial results for the config. There are 3 configs, right? But we ask, is it enough? The answer is no. Because there are lots of relationships among these configs, especially among the configs in the kconfig mechanism of Linux kernel. So if you follow these relationships, you will get a longer list. But we will ask, is it enough? The answer is still no. Because if you look at some public proof of concept, you will see there is a keyword NFQ, right? But if you want to enable the NFQ config, the NFQ feature for the net filter, you need to enable this config. And finally, at that time, we can reproduce this vulnerability. So you can't trigger a vulnerability which has been patched, right, for the incorrect version. And you can't trigger a vulnerability which doesn't exist or is inaccessible. The first problem is the version, and the second problem is the config. So here, we will present our approach. You can see we have some insights. The presence of patch, it implies the absence of the vulnerability, right? If the version is patched, there is no such vulnerabilities. And secondly, the kernel configs, it can be regarded as a graph, just like the picture we show here. We can follow the relationships and regard the config as a node and the relationship as an edge. So the first one is also still about patch, and the second solution is about graph. Okay, now let's welcome my co-speaker to introduce the following.
Thanks, Bonan, for introducing the first part. Now let me take away to introduce our framework, KernJC, how to reproduce the vulnerability environment. You can see this is the overview of our approach. Given the CV information and the release information, what we are doing first is that we want to profile the vulnerability and we want to collect the vulnerability information. such as how to describe the CVE and what is the vulnerable kernel version, so that we can use it to reproduce or reconstruct the vulnerable environment in the future. Given the basic information about the vulnerability, the next step is to address the is to select the correct version that have the vulnerability. To do this, we perform the patch analysis to detect the vulnerable version. Given the vulnerable version, you know it is not enough to reproduce or reconstruct the kernel, the vulnerability environment, and we need to identify the correct configures to build the environment. And to achieve this, we build the key config graph and do the reachability analysis to find all the configs that are required for the vulnerability reconstruction. Based on all the information, we do the prevision environment, and we build the kernel environment and provision the virtual machine, which can be used for security analysis. For the first part, it is vulnerability information profiling. Here, you can see, given a new CVE ID, what we do it. And we will first identify the patch commit. Given the patch commit, and we find the patch content. For example, here, from the patch content, we can know that to patch it, here, it is one buffer flag at 0. Then we will identify where the patch is, and here we identify which file it is in. Not only the patch information, we also find other information to describe the vulnerabilities, such as the text description to describe the vulnerability. We also include the version information from the MVD dataset. Inside, not only this information, we also include the information such as CVSS information and CW information, which can be or may be used in the later analysis. We also include the kernel version list information here. You know, in the MVD dataset, sometimes it only gives us the version ID, which version or which range version are vulnerable, and we need to maintain the list of the kernel. So we also maintain this information. Given the basic information, next step is to identify the vulnerable version of kernel. How do we do it? We just use the patch analysis. You know, if give one vulnerability, if we first to patch it, it should be patched successfully. And then if we repatch it, what will happen? It will give us several warning or alerts that we cannot patch it again. For example, here, if we patch it again, and it will just tell us that line deletion not found. So we can see that this vulnerability has been patched. So we cannot use this version kernel as our target. Based on these approaches, how do we identify the target kernel version? We first located the latest vulnerability version claimed by the MVD, and we do the backward tracking, start the version, and move downward along the kernel version list to do the patch analysis. For example, here we do 3 patch analysis, and we find that for the first 3 kernel version, all of them are failed. So we can say that these 3 kernel versions has been patched. So we cannot use it as our target. However, for the 4th version, and we find it can be patched and it is vulnerable. So we can use it as our target kernel to build our vulnerable environment. Given the correct version kernel, next we need to identify the correct configures that has been described by Bonan. That we need to identify all the configures that are required to enable the vulnerability in the kernel. Generally, based on our investigation from the kernel or some vulnerabilities, we found that there are several data sources can include the vulnerability configures required. First is the description. From the description, you know, for example, we can find that this CVE need configures such as the POSIX temper, and we also find that some path level configures are required. For example, here, the makefile here, it needs to include the config such as, oh, sorry, I can't see. Net filter, yeah, net filter. Also, we notice that in some code level information, for example, in the source code here, in the beginning of the code, it defines use the configure such as compat. So we need to include all the configures required that we can identify from the different data source. Here we call it direct configures because we can just retrieve it from the data source we have provided. Given the seed or the basis of the direct configs, next we use the graph to represent the configs in the kernel, to represent or mine what configs are required. Here you can see, given the key config graph, we first identify or gather direct configs we have claimed just in the last slide. It includes the describe level configs and path level configs and code level configs. And we do the reachability analysis. For each config C in the direct configures, we do the reachability analysis to find the configs it need. And we will identify several configs that cannot be found in the direct configures. We also try to investigate the relationship in the key config graphs, such as the slack relationship and the dependent relationship to get all the hidden configures. Based on this, we have collected the direct configures and the hidden configures, and we merge them together to describe all the configures that are required by the vulnerability information. Based on this, we have the vulnerable kernel version and all the configures it requires, so we can build the vulnerability environment. Is right? And to investigate whether our approach can find all the configures, we just use the CVE 2021-2255 as an example. This is all the configures that had been found by manually, and based on our approach, we find that we can get all the configures, and we can also make it clearly fall into 4 categories, which can be easily analyzed by the security analyst. So it can better facilitate the vulnerable environment reconstruction based on our approach, and we can build the vulnerable environment quickly and have for the security analysis. Okay, maybe next let's Bona introduce our evaluation.
Okay, thanks, Jiahao. Okay, before introducing our evaluation, we want to emphasize the Docker-like interaction. That is from our own reproduction experience. So during our analysis of kernel vulnerabilities, usually we find it is a dirty work. We must download like the source code, compile it, and maybe before compiling, we need to configure some configs and compile it for a long time and run it. There may be lots of files, and it is hard to manage them. So here, we want to provide a unified interaction command line. You can see here we provide lots of sub-commands like the Docker. You can use them to manage your kernel reproduction environment. For example, if you want to build a reproduction environment for a vulnerability, you can just run KJC build and the CVID. Then KernJC will help you to build the environment fully automatically. And after you build it, you can use the PS to list all the current existing environments in your host. You can also use the info, just like querying the information of a container. You can use it to query the information about the kernel environment. And if you want to start your environment, you can just import the KJC start and add the environment ID. Also, if you want to make your reproduction faster, you can add some options to Kernel. You can just pass them here, like the enable KVM. Also here, actually there are more options like enable the KASLR or other mitigation by implemented by the kernel. And after you have started the environment, it is your responsibility to like craft the POC and compile it. And then you can use the KGC CP to copy it into the environment, just like copy things into a container. And to help you trace the execution of your POC, you can use KGC logs. You can open it in a new terminal, and then in the existing terminal, you can just attach to the container, and you can run the POC. And in your terminal of the logs, you will find the trace, which is a sanitizer reporting there is a bug being triggered. And after all of this, you can just run the KGC RM to remove the environments. So after that, you have finished your reproduction, which is very neat and clean. And here I will show you a demo, which is exactly the motivation example we just showed you before about the CV 2021-22555. Sorry. Yeah, here we just run the KGC and with the CV ID and start the environment, compile the POC, and copy it into the environment. We open a log terminal and run the POC. In the log terminal, you can find the bug is triggered. Okay, now let's talk about the evaluations. Actually, we prepare a data set of 66 kernel vulnerabilities. And we just run KernJC to build the environment for all of them. And finally, we use the prepared POC to see whether the POC can be run and the vulnerability can be triggered in the target environment. We also compare the environment built by KernJC with the default config environment. And you can see in the evaluation results, all the environments built by KernJC are effective. That means you can trigger or reproduce all the vulnerabilities in our modified environment. And about half of the vulnerabilities cannot be reproduced in the default config environment. And we even found among these 66 vulnerabilities, there are 4 vulnerabilities are detected to have incorrect version claims in NVD. So if you select these versions for these vulnerabilities, it will take you a long time to detect it and reproduce it. And we also noticed that about half of the vulnerability, they need the non-default configs identified by KernJC. And here is a more detailed statistics about the vulnerability dataset. You can see in the table, there is a box in purple color. And for this vulnerability, actually, we found in the CV description from NVD, there is claims from like the analyst or expert. They said this vulnerability may be related to some configs, but these configs, they may not exist in the logic relationship of the vulnerability itself. So that's why we include the description level configs as our direct configs. And there are also other observations. you can find from this table, many vulnerabilities come from the eBPF subsystem and the net filter system. And if you look closer, you will find for these vulnerabilities, they need many of the non-default configs identified by KernJC. While for other vulnerabilities, it may be very easy if you just reproduce it with the default configs, no configs. And here, we also use the KernJC to run through all the kernel vulnerabilities in NVD database. We want to see how many incorrect versions for vulnerabilities exist in NVD database. Because this is a database used by many people all over the world daily life. And we identify more than 100 vulnerabilities, kernel vulnerabilities, with incorrect version claims in NVD. And still, if you use these versions for the vulnerability reproduction, you will fail. Okay, now let's talk about some interesting things. So why we call it KernJC? Actually, Kern is a kernel, right? This is very intuitive. And JC is actually 教场 in ancient China. And it's referred to a site dedicated to the military training and competition. So we want to release these two as KernJC, means it will help you easily build a training site for your production. And here we release the KernJC code on GitHub, so you can download it and give it a try. This is our group. We have a homepage, so if you want to learn more about our research, you can just visit this link. Okay, that's all. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm ready to answer.